Hi, my name is Len Schappa, and I'm from the Department of Politics here at UVA. Um, I'm delivering this lecture to your class at the invitations of Professors Kunakhovich and Achilles, who asked me to introduce the case of fascism in Japan to you. They also suggested that it might be interesting for you to learn a little bit about how political scientists study this topic or the case of fascism in Japan in kind of a comparative context. And so I'm going to start today by sharing with you a little information about how political scientists study this subject. You will see that we focus a lot less on what the experience of fascism is like to the people at that time, or these kinds of considerations, which are addressed, much more by historians, but instead tend to focus on the key moments of breakdown. What was it that caused a country to go from maybe an emerging democracy status to a shift suddenly towards authoritarianism? Trying to understand the causes of that, how it happens, is something that political scientists are definitely very interested in. So after I introduce the general project of how we try to understand this in political science, I'm going to get down to sharing with you some of the key events in the moment that we see as the point at which Japan's emerging democracy broke down between 1930 and 1932. And you can see exactly how it happened, and there will be some disturbing parallels, I think you will see, to some of the things that are happening in the United States to today. So then in the final section of the lecture today, I will focus on two particular explanations that help us understand the Japanese case and also have broader support. There's often a flaw in the institutional design, something about the way the political institutions were set up that made it prone to a breakdown. So we'll talk a little bit about those. And then we'll talk about another part of the story that's emphasized in the two readings that are assigned for today's class. And that is the failure of the democratic political parties to defend the democratic system when faced with challenges from the military and other fascist forces inside Japan. So the failure to pull together competing parties to defend democracy is partly explained by the extreme polarization between these two parties in the early 1930s. And we'll try to understand why that condition was present. Okay, so this is a chart that helps you see how political scientists try to understand the subject of democratic breakdown and the emergence of authoritarian or fascist regimes. What I've featured here is a coding scheme that's used by many political scientists to understand this topic. We tend not to divide regimes into a simple bimodal democracy or authoritarian. We tend to understand that there's more of a continuum from full democracy to autocracy. The database that I draw on here is called Polity. You can find the scoring system online, and you can also link to it right here at the bottom of the screen if you want to see how other countries in other contexts have been coded. But I wanted to illustrate what the coding scheme considers to be a full democracy. Canada in 2018. The United States falls a little short of that at an 8. And then you can see some other regimes here that are more in between, have some characteristics of democracy and some characteristics of authoritarianism. We use the term anocracy to categorize those systems. And then at the other extreme, you see the regimes that we categorize as autocracy or authoritarian regimes. Political scientists tend not to be very interested in exactly what type of authoritarian regime this is. Is it a communist regime? Is it a fascist regime? Our interest is in the completely closed character of that regime, not open to anyone else's participation, dominated by a single person or a very small group of elites. That leads it to be categorized as an autocracy. Okay, now this coding scheme emerged from the efforts of political scientists to understand the emergence of new democracies and the breakdown of some democracies in the post-war period. So the coding scheme is very well developed and has been used by a lot of different political scientists looking at post-war cases. But in the last decade or so, political scientists have started to code more historical cases. And you can see here the example of Franco's Spain, coded at a -7, Hitler's Germany, coded as a -10. Now, I was curious to see how Japan has been coded. I've not used this database to understand the breakdown of democracy in Japan, but somebody apparently is using a database that it turns out categorizes Japan today as a full democracy, as you can see here, and Japan before the war as a anocracy. So the coding system that political scientists have been used, I was disappointed to see, treated Japan as not having changed much at all between 1868, when the Meiji system began, to the end of the war, 1945, coded as a 1 throughout that period, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. It's true that for much of that period, there was a single constitution in effect, the Meiji Constitution of 1890. It was in effect from that point until the end of the war in 1945. So maybe that's the basis for giving it a single number. I see, if you look at these other examples of countries coded today, that in 1930, Japan had become an emerging democracy. True, the Constitution made the emperor sovereign and did not declare the people sovereign in the way that a true democratic constitution would, but there were free elections, universal manhood suffrage. The winner of the party who won that election formed the cabinet and supplied the prime minister. In many respects, it was an emerging democracy. But between 1930 and 1940, Japan had a clear slide towards authoritarianism. And that is the change that I'm going to focus on today. So political scientists will put that kind of a shift among this kind of groups of cases of democratic breakdown. And you can see that how the political scientists have coded those. Spain in 1938 is seen as having gone from a 7 to a -7. A more contemporary case is Turkey under Erdogan, having gone from a 9 to a -4. So Japan's breakdown in the 1940s would be treated as being among these cases, even though, as you know, the regimes that emerge from these various episodes are not identical. Not all of them are necessarily called fascism, but they were certainly all authoritarian, and political scientists want to understand that. Why did it break down? Why did they end up with some version of authoritarianism? Now, if any of you are interested in how political scientists actually use this quantitative analysis using these numbers, I've given you a citation here of one example of a study that looked at large numbers of regimes over the post-war period and tried to understand why some of them suddenly broke down and others did not. So there have been a lot of studies of this type, as well as some that are more qualitative and focused on exploring specific cases in a little more detail. But these studies have tended to focus on these types of explanations for why you have democratic breakdown in some countries and not others. Institutional flaws, presidential systems are seen as being more vulnerable to breaking down than parliamentary systems, for example. Certainly, if there's an absence of civilian control of the military, that's a problem. Socioeconomic conditions are seen as contributing to breakdown if there's wide inequality, landlordism, and if there's a resource curse. That means if your country is cursed with having a large amount of oil, for example, you get different kind of politics that is more prone to authoritarianism. Finally, elite defection. that political parties sometimes are so hostile to each other that one of them will defect from the democratic game and turn to allies in the military to try to gain an advantage. So these are some of the factors that have been found by political scientists doing these studies. And I think you're going to see when we dig into the Japanese case today that there is some support for many of these in the story from that country. Now I want to turn to the period in which many historians, as well as political scientists, think that the breakdown actually took place. The moment when Japan could have gone maybe in another direction, but then instead shifted dramatically towards authoritarianism. And that is between the years 1930 and 1932. The starting point for this is probably the high point of pre-war Japanese democracy. In February 1930, there was a free and open election in which two political parties, Minseto and Seiyukai, competed against each other. This was held under universal manhood suffrage, so it wasn't like a narrow franchise. All Japanese men, regardless of class, were allowed to vote, and they had a clear choice between two parties offering quite distinct platforms. And the winner of that election, Minseto Party, was able to supply the prime ministership to its party leader, Mr. Hamaguchi. And the party came out of this election with majority control of the Diet and full control of the cabinet. This, in many ways, sounds like a British parliamentary system, what Japan had in 1930. But there were clearly some limits to this. At the time, universal manhood suffrage was instituted in 1925. They made it part of the legislative deal that made this possible was giving the governments extensive police powers to make sure that the unions and other opponents of the regime were not able to threaten the state's authority. And so Japan operated under some already pretty serious police powers that are probably not consistent with calling Japan a full democracy during that time. But it was much more democratic than it had been up to that time, and certainly than it would be a few years later. So a key turning point here was the moment when the Minseto's party leader, the Prime Minister Hamaguchi, was shot by a member of an ultra-nationalist secret society. The secret society was headed by a politician from the rival Seiyukai. And it was sparked a lot of worry on the part of the media and others about what was happening here. And yet we did not see the parties pull together in the face of this attack on democratic norms, the use of violence in a case like this. Hamaguchi did not die immediately. He was gravely injured, and he was suffering and unable to serve as prime minister for a while. But while he limped along, his deputy, the foreign minister Shidehara, stepped into the acting prime minister role and continued to pursue the party's policies. Among these policies was support for the latest naval arms control treaty called the London Naval Treaty, under which Japan agreed to continue and extend limits on naval vessel building that had been adopted since the 1920s. In support of this policy, the Minseto was also limiting spending on the military. This party was committed to avoiding budget deficits and keeping the budget under control. And so it was carrying out these economic and foreign policies despite the assassination attempt that had taken place in November. And here's where we begin to see the disturbing failure of the other political party to join with Minseto to stand up against this kind of political violence. In January 1931, a leading politician from the Seiyukai party, his name was Hatoyama, and interestingly, he would go on to become a prime minister in 1955 after the war. But at this particular moment, he attacked the Minseto's weak foreign policy for failing to stand up against challenges to Japan's rights in China. The other legislatures from the Seiyukai attacked the party's economic policy and called what they were doing in foreign policy and economic policy lying propaganda. So this was a kind of a put down that the other party could not tolerate. So it ended up triggering a brawl in the Diet in which members of the opposing parties started attacking each other. But that was not the low point. In March 1931, Hamaguchi was feeling well enough that he returned to the Diet to engage in Prime Minister's question time, and the Seiyukai party proceeded to again challenge him aggressively. So Hatoyama asked him how he could continue as prime minister in his physical condition, and among other attacks on Hamaguchi that continued for several hours. They then took a break. When at 9 p.m. that day, Hamaguchi did not reappear to continue the questioning, Seiyukai members shouted, "Bring out Hamaguchi," and rushed the podium to prevent the session from continuing. The Seiyukai party tabled a no confidence motion and organized 2 mass protests outside the Diet building, which descended into a riot. Among those participating in the protests or riots were a group known as the Youth Vanguard of another right-wing patriotic group, which paraded around the grounds with banners calling for revolution to restore direct imperial rule. So there's no television video footage of this event, but I picture something very much like January 6th taking place in Japan at that moment, with the Seiyukai party mobilizing their people out in the streets to demonstrate with banners and speeches against a Hamaguchi who is still recovering from an assassination attempt. A couple months later then, in May, another of the right-wing nationalist groups is implicated in a bombing attempt on the home of the finance minister for the Minseto finance minister named Inoue. They destroyed the gate of his house, but did not actually injure the finance minister. So this is the kind of fighting that was taking place between the 2 political parties that are supposed to be democratically competing against each other, Minseto and Seiyukai, throughout 1931, that provides the context for the event that's well known in history as the moment when Japan began its incursions into Chinese territory, the beginning of the China War in many ways, and the beginning of the Pacific War and a part of World War II. The key event here happened in October later that year, when Japan's Kwantung Army, which had duties to maintain the security of Japan's rail assets in Manchuria. Manchuria was not yet a colony, but Japan had financial and economic interests there, and Japan had received permission to defend these interests. But at this moment, they staged an incident to make it look like local terrorists had attacked the railroad, and they proceeded to use that as an excuse to attack the Chinese forces in the area and to eventually invade and occupy the entire green territory shown in the map here, which would later become the colony of Manchukuo. All of this happened without permission from Tokyo. So the Japanese army on its own, taking advantage of squabbling political parties back in the capital, were able to pursue their foreign policy without this being under the control of the democratic parties. Minseto was then put in a very difficult position. The military victories, the expansion of Japan's territory was treated as a major victory in the newspapers. The Seiyukai certainly trumpeted this as carrying out the kind of foreign policy they wanted to see. So on defensive in this way, the Minseto ends up splitting under fire for trying to deal with the aftermath of the Manchurian incident and the backlash, diplomatic backlash that followed, which had opened the door. The split of the party opens the door for the Seiyukai cabinet to come in under Prime Minister Inukai and to schedule new elections, which we'll see it proceeds to win. But before that happens, the military again takes advantage of the disarray in domestic politics back in Japan to stage another incident in the major city of Shanghai, which they then used as an excuse to bomb the city from the air and to fight another battle on the streets of Shanghai in 1932. So this was the atmosphere in which a truly fascist group, the Blood Pledge Corps, under the leadership of this man, who had been influenced by the fascist thinker Kita-Ikki, brought together a group of his followers, some of them with ties to the military, and they agreed to carry out a terrorist incident in which each man who was part of the group would be responsible for one kill of various members of the political and business elite. And they would then proceed to carry out this plan in the spring of 1932. The first victim of this assassination campaign was the Minseto's prime ministerial candidate, who had previously been finance minister, who they had already tried to bomb. That was Mr. Inoue. This time he is assassinated and killed as he campaigned for office. Seiyukai keeps the election going, proceeds to win the election, and Mr. Inukai takes over, continues as prime minister. But that turned out to be only the first of several assassinations. Just 1 month later, the leader of the Mitsui Business Group, a giant business conglomerate in Japan, is slain by another member of the group. And then in May 15th, 1932, this is often known as the May 15th incident, the group assassinated Seiyukai Prime Minister Inukai and bombed Mitsubishi Bank and the Bank of Japan. So it turned out that despite Seiyukai's attempts to take advantage of the situation and gain an advantage on the Minseto during a time when civilian and democratic rule was under challenge, that Inukai himself fell victim to this group of terrorists, and along with several other major economic institutions in Japan. Disturbingly, after this series of assassinations, the group of terrorists who instigated them got off with light sentences after many Japanese pleaded for leniency for these so-called patriots. I think you can see that by this moment in 1932, Japan's democracy has seriously eroded, but there are still some basic features of democratic rule that are continuing for the next couple of years. There are still competitive elections contested between these two parties, Seiyukai and Minseto. They're held in 1936 and 1937. So there's the trappings of democracy there, but the party leaders of these parties, regardless of the outcome of the election, have chosen by this time not to try to serve as prime minister. They're going to defer to a military figure to stand at the head of the cabinet. And so this is a major compromise. The Army and Navy ministries are also under the control of the militarists. So important parts of the cabinet are now under the control of the military. But there are still civilian figures in this period. Seiyukai's leading economic policy thinker, Mr. Takahashi, remained an influential figure in these cabinets. He served as finance minister throughout this period. He is not from the military. He was one of the people who came out of the more civilian Democratic Party background. But even he, it turns out, was living on borrowed time. Mr. Takahashi himself was then assassinated by a group of young army officers in February 26, 1936, as part of a failed coup attempt. This time there were hundreds of members of the military, members of the faction that believed the emperor should rule Japan directly, and that they should get rid of entirely of all of these trappings of democracy. This group of people fought in the streets for several weeks, trying to gain control of the country. They were eventually defeated. The emperor himself came out against the people who were acting in his name, and the coup leaders were executed this time. So finally, some people came together to try to put a stop to political violence. But by this time, both of the political parties' leaderships have been targeted repeatedly with political violence. They've been cowed into standing aside and allowing the military to take increasing control of the country. So that by 1937 to 1945, especially as the full-scale war in China gets started in 1937, Japan is firmly under the control of the military and government bureaucrats. Now, this is a picture of the cabinet of General Tojo, the most famous figure from Japan's war years. But this was not quite like the Nazi Party and fascist rule in Germany, because these men were from a variety of walks of life. Some of them were from the military, but quite a few of them came out of the Japanese bureaucracy. They were economic bureaucrats, they were police bureaucrats. I have highlighted here this man, Mr. Kishi, who was a member of Tojo's cabinet and was prosecuted after the war as a war criminal. But Mr. Kishi had been an economic bureaucrat who had practiced more authoritarian economic management of the colony of Manchuria, and he returned to Japan during the war to put in place many of those techniques that he had practiced in Manchuria to operate the country under economic mobilization to increase the state's power over large parts of the economy. And there were other bureaucrats that were part of this, that were part of the police organization, that used their skills that they had gained in the colonies to keep Japan under control during the war. Eventually, during this time, you should know that there were, again, a couple of elections held, but by 1940, most of the politicians, including many who had previously been in Seiyukai and Minseto, had joined in a single organization called the Imperial Rural Assistance Association, and they ran for office in 1942 under this IRAA banner. But even at that time, 1942, there were some politicians who ran without being part of the IRAA and still won. So Japan had some trappings of democracy, even at the height of World War II. I'm now going to turn to looking at some of the explanations for what happened. I think you could see the beginnings of these explanations in the kind of blow-by-blow account of what happened in the 1930s. But here we step back and try to put this in the context of institutional flaws, the kinds of arguments that political scientists have developed to understand the breakdown of democracy in many other contexts. the Japanese adopted their first constitution in 1890, known as the Meiji Constitution, named after the Meiji emperor who bestowed this on the people as his gift, um, and had come to power in 1868 at the age of 15, when a group of samurai rebelled against the old regime of the Tokugawa system, to put in place a more modern regime that was going to respond to the challenge of the West. And so part of Japan's response to the challenge of the West was to say, we have a modern constitution like many European countries. They studied the German Constitution and others, and introduced some of the features that they found in these other constitutions in 1890, partly to show the world that Japan was a modern country, that they should end unequal treaties. Japan had the rule of law like other modern countries. And so one of the things they adopted was creating an elected legislature known as the Diet that had taxing and budget powers, so that the government of Japan would not be able to increase taxes or adopt a budget without the support of this elected legislature. The franchise initially was strictly limited to the wealthiest Japanese, as were many other constitutions, of course, in the 19th century. It also provided for due process and other legal rights, again, because the regime was trying to show the world that they had the rule of law. Now, a lot of things in this constitution are quite vague, and they allowed room for shifting the way things were done through practice or norms, sort of in the way the British Constitution evolves over time. So this system evolves gradually over the period after 1890, so that the political parties start operating within the Diet, and they start asserting the rights of the Diet to control taxing power, to provide a check on the oligarchs who were running the government in the name of the Meiji Emperor. And over time, these political parties start to argue for more democracy. And so by 1925, the Diet passes a law that provides universal manhood suffrage, so that at this point, all Japanese, regardless of class, are allowed to vote in elections. During this period, Japan also has a vibrant press where you have competing perspectives battling it out in the newspapers and other publications. And there's enough going on here that many people at the time and later described the 1920s as the period of Taisho democracy, named after the Taisho emperor who succeeded the Emperor Meiji and had some mental disabilities that particularly limited his ability to intervene in politics. Nevertheless, the Constitution had some serious flaws, and it starts with the way the Constitution makes the emperor and not the people sovereign, so that the cabinet serves the emperor, not the people. Especially at the beginning, it was not clear that the cabinet would come out of the legislature in the way it does in Britain today. So it was only gradually that you started to see more party politicians coming out of the Diet and serving in the cabinet alongside members of the aristocracy and figures from the military and members of this oligarchy that had been ruling in the emperor's name. So it's a gradual and shift in norms that allows the cabinet by 1930 to be made up almost entirely of members of the legislature, much more on the model of British parliamentary rule. But all of this was based on norms rather than formal rules. Even the ability of the press to report freely is not guaranteed in the Constitution. It can be limited by the law. The final flaw, which you could also hear in the blow-by-blow account, is the absence of clear civilian control of the military. The Constitution makes the Army and Navy, places the Army and Navy under the command of the Emperor. Now, of course, the ability of the Army and Navy to acquire equipment requires money, that requires taxes. So the Diet is also supposed to be involved here in managing military affairs, but it's ambiguous. When it comes to something like a naval arms control, the civilian politicians insisted that this was part of their responsibility as the cabinet, as the prime minister. They could enter into international agreements that would commit Japan to arms control. But the Army and the Navy, many people in the Army and the Navy, insisted that the Constitution put them in charge, and the civilians were going beyond their remit in trying to tell the Navy that they had to limit their acquisitions of equipment under an arms control treaty. So this was one of the sources of the serious rift that takes place between the Democratic parties and the military during the period we've talked about, is that the institutions didn't make it clear who was in charge. Okay, so the other main explanation that you certainly get in the reading that you've done for this week, and I'll just outline here at the end of today's lecture, is the emphasis on the polarization that had emerged between the two democratic political parties, Seiyukai and Minseto. You've heard their names over and over, but maybe it will help us make sense of this if we see that the Seiyukai party is regarded as the more conservative party and the Minseto is regarded as the more liberal party. Now, I think it's important to recognize here that liberal is used here in the kind of European sense, believing in free enterprise and a limited size of government and limited government regulation, that kind of a liberal. So Japanese voters at this time had a choice between a liberal party and a conservative party, but they were completely polarized on the two most important issues of the day. I think it's useful to compare here the amount of polarization that existed in Japan at that moment with for example, what things looked like in the United States during the Cold War. During the Cold War in the US, you had a Democratic Party and a Republican Party. They both agreed on the containment strategy for dealing with the primary security threat the United States faced. They believed that the US needed a strong military, needed lots of alliances to defend against the challenge of communism. There was a view that politics stopped at the water's edge. Yes, there were some important debates, for example, during the Vietnam War, over exactly what the government policy should be, what the foreign policy should be, but they were agreed on the basic framework of Cold War containment strategy for the Soviet Union. There's also a lot of agreement on economic policy during that time. Both parties saw the usefulness of Keynesian economic demand management and using government intervention at key moments when the economy was slowing down to strengthen it again so that you could maintain relatively stable growth and low unemployment. So I want to contrast that kind of agreement that you saw between Democratic and Republican Party for much of the post-war period in the United States with what things look like in Japan at this time. There was a huge disagreement on both foreign policy and economic policy. The first was over what to do about Japan's foreign policy. So by this time of the 1920s, Japan has already fought two imperial wars. First, they defeat China and they gain the colony of Taiwan. Then they defeat the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War, and they gain the colony of Korea. But by the 1920s, after World War II, Japan has started to accept the rules of what's known as the Washington system. Japan has committed not to expand its imperial territory in China. But there's a big debate on what exactly Japan should do to make sure its interests are protected in its in the areas closest to its empire where it feels threatened. Now, the Seiyukai Party believes that Japan needs to aggressively defend its rights in Manchuria and China. There is a view that if the things get out of control in this area or become too unstable, the Soviet Union could gain dominance in this area, and this would immediately threaten Japan's interests in the region. There's also worried about growing nationalism in China and the way boycotts and other and protests are challenging Japan's economic interests in China. So the Seiyukai believes that what Japan needs to do is make sure that its army that's located along the South Manchurian Railway can aggressively pursue Japan's interests in this part of China and make sure that Japan's interests are served, even with the use of military force. On the other side, the Minseto Party thinks that Japan can achieve its goals in the region through a more liberal system. It should use investment, loans, contracts to expand its influence in Manchuria. There's plenty of room to do informal empire there by expanding the railway network, making deals that will expand industrialization in the area under Japan's economic influence without necessarily having to use military force to assert Japan's control. The liberals in Japan are much more are aware that any attempt to use the military to expand Japan's territory will immediately bring it into conflict with the two other leading powers in the world, the British and the Americans, as well as aggravate relations with the Soviet Union. They think that the best strategy here is to cooperate with the Americans and the Europeans, who are also interested in gaining economic influence in China. So Japan can increase its influence in Manchuria while cooperating with the British, increasing their influence elsewhere. And the Minseto feels that this is a perfectly adequate foreign policy. Now, you could see how that came apart under the strains of the Manchurian incident, with the Seiyukai feeling that what the army was doing there was consistent with their foreign policy, whereas the Minseto felt that they were the ones actually in power, and their own foreign policy was completely ignored by the army. So while that divide over foreign policy is very well known, I think by even casual students of Asian history, a little bit less well known is the divide that existed during that time over economic policy between the Minseto and the Seiyukai. So Japan is dealing with a difficult economic situation in the 1920s. During World War II, this is a graph showing wholesale price inflation. And so you can see the rapid increase in prices that took place during World War I as the Japanese economy expanded rapidly to take advantage of markets that were left open by the European powers being involved in the war. And this contributed to inflation in Japan. And the orthodox solution to out of control inflation was to raise interest rates, to use the gold standard to keep a lid on prices. And so the Minseto very much subscribed to this liberal commitment to the gold standard and to using deflation to keep the economy from having out of control inflation. And under their rule during the 1920s, Japan has several periods of abrupt deflation. Here you can see one, here you can see one, and here you can see one. Each time it went down sharply declining prices, you saw bank failures as banks were unable to collect loans that their borrowers could no longer repay once you had deflation this sharp. So this meant a lot of suffering for the Japanese people as the banks closed in several periods and people couldn't borrow money. And um, many people who were indebted lost their businesses. Farmers found that they were so deeply in debt that some of them felt they needed to sell their daughters into prostitution as the only way they could redeem some of their debts or find enough money for food. So this was the consequence of an orthodox gold standard deflation policy that the Liberal Party was insisting on during much of the 1920s, and it caused a lot of economic suffering. In contrast, the Seiyukai, or Conservative Party, this is, again, doesn't quite fit the conservative label, but they were more interested in innovating with economic policy, supporting fiscal expansion. Don't worry so much about balancing the budget. Let's go ahead and spend government money to expand the railway system, to support industrial development. And so every time they came to power, they loosened the fiscal controls and tried to stop deflation. You saw several episodes where things leveled off. Those were periods when the Seiyukai was involved in running policy. In the end, amidst this turmoil that we heard about in 1930 to 32, the leader of the Seiyukai's economic policy, Mr. Takahashi, comes to power. And between 1932 and when he is assassinated in 1936, he puts in place a economic policy that's often referred to as military Keynesianism, where the government starts spending money that it doesn't have, printing money, in essence, to dig Japan out of its deflationary hole. He's able to get economic growth going again. And ironically, just as he is assassinated, Japan enters a period of steady economic growth as it heads off towards war, towards a war economy. Okay, so you can see here that the divisions are quite deep, not easily bridged. The difference between deflation and fiscal expansion is a pretty big gap, and the parties couldn't bridge this gap, and that had something to do with why one was taking advantage of the disarray caused by these right-wing groups that were assassinating and attacking the other party. So this party polarization over these issues allowed the fascists eventually to take charge in Japan. The people we saw here earlier, the state bureaucrats, the police, the military, end up stepping into the gap created by the bickering political parties, riding this wave of political violence to assert authoritarian control over the country and lead Japan into the disastrous war against China and the United States that was to lead to its total defeat. Okay, I hope that when you get together and have a live discussion about the Japanese case with Robert Stoltz, and maybe if I can join you, we can talk more about this period and questions you might have. Thank you.